I know both of you have been talking to each other before this, and it seems to me, as I'm, of course, listening to both of you, how much your strategy could help you, Jen, achieve your goals. And so what are your thoughts about the relationships between what the two of you are doing, and how might there be some crossover?
Great. I love the synergy of what you have feeding forward and the fact that it's independent, that you don't need to go to the government funding and all the contentious part there that tends to hamstring real activities. So the real achievements that you have are profound, and part of my work life is sitting around the table with people who don't necessarily want to talk to each other, stock growers, people who are interested in the conservation community, researchers, and people who are landowners, and the difficulty of having those conversations is always mitigated by putting a map on the table. It's like magic, because it's that common currency of information that binds all of us together. If we can take a look at that and understand what we have in common, which is the landscape, then you can start to talk, and it looks like you've incredibly capitalized on that.
Well, it was a good first step, and I think there's a lot of room for refinement. But I think what may be interesting about this concept going forward is how to adapt it to other locations with other sets of circumstances. Because arguably, we had a very unique kind of coming together in Collier County. We had some large landowners. We had growth pressures, which was the economic driver. So to me, the fascinating thing would be, okay, what happens if you try to use the same idea, but maybe one of those elements may not be the same, or maybe there is public funding or the need for public management as opposed to private management, and can you kind of figure out a way to adapt it to maybe private lands that are around Yellowstone, to kind of widen the green belt around that area.
Yeah, and I think that's a critical question that faces all of these kinds of efforts, because we do have a lot in common, which is how do you move that game out into the wider sphere, and then you move to global challenges. My brother lives in Africa, and you're looking at people who are making decisions about maybe keeping a set aside or feeding their family, and the critical pressures that none of us face in those conservation matrices are so real and so intense, and how to drive that forward in a way that's got an end game in mind.
Right. Al, how replicable is what you did with your stewardship program to other parts of the country? And why hasn't this taken off elsewhere?
Well, I'm not sure that it's a well-told story yet in other locations. I think, generally speaking, TDR kinds of programs that have had a very poor record of actually accomplishing what they've set out to do. But I think it's adaptable if you boil it back to the essential premise, which it has to be built on high-quality data. It requires the willingness of property owners to participate in a program, which means there has to be an economic incentive, which means there has to be something driving the other side of the credit exchange. So if you had an area that had all the same attributes, but you had no potential growth pressure, you'd have to find another way to drive credit values. And maybe that would be public funding. But but if you do have those ingredients, which if you look at most fast-growing urbanizing areas, they're all dealing with this issue of they call it urban sprawl, but in reality it's rural sprawl. I mean, it's going out into the countryside, and it's fragmenting. So I think if you have those conditions, and if you have a willingness to take the time, to put it together. I mean, it was mentioned this morning that these processes require a lot of time to develop the trust and the rapport, and then you got to figure out sort of the mechanics of it. But I think it would be replicable. I think when I was listening to Jen's talk, I mean, what I was intrigued at is the sophistication of our environmental natural resource index is probably pretty basic compared to what you have done. So the idea of sort of ratcheting up maybe the sophistication of the natural resource index so that it becomes maybe useful in other ways than just a stewardship credit, which is how we use it now. So.
Yeah, and to standardize those maps of animal habitat too, because that's the community that I live and work in, is people who will spend a whole lot of time fighting about where's polar bear habitat and how is that model developed and validated, and then of course you do end up in court if you have the Endangered Species Act in play. Right. And so those maps become the entity of decision. And so the importance of making those be really robust is so important.
Yeah, great. Yeah. How about the audience? Any Thoughts, comments, questions? Yes?
Jeff, that's a fascinating presentation. It seems that accurate, reliable data that's recognized by all parties is absolutely critical for this. So who pays for acquiring that data in the first place?
A lot of it's available through the government. What we did was work through a huge variety of funding sources because we served as a data library. So we worked with everyone from the DoD, NASA, USGS, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, you name it, state and federal agencies, National Park Service, and everyone who has a stake in a piece of ground has a stake in having imagery. And remotely sensed data is so available now at such an incredibly accelerating rate. I mean, you look at Terra and Aqua and all the different sensors that are out, and it's such a galloping area of new research. I don't think the mapping is the problem. I think it's the conceptual architecture to feed the maps into and the mental model of how we interpret these 3 terabytes daily from Terra and Aqua coming in. What do we feed those into, and how do we act given the onslaught, the fire hose of data? That's the really tricky bet now.
Yeah. In our case, we had lots of sources of data, but there was no GIS information. Nobody had ever compiled it into a usable form, so it was like boxes and boxes and disks of data. So in our case, the private property owners, as part of their commitment to the collaboration, actually paid to put the GIS system in place, which is part of what our company did, which was, as I said, over half of the budget and half of the time was spent just getting to the point where we could start the planning process. So fast forward to today, Florida and a lot of other locations now have, a lot of this information that's already in a usable form. So now you can focus a lot more of the effort into sort of the, what you do with it piece of the equation. But yeah, so it would have been a lot different today than it was in 2000 for us. But.
Yeah. But a key piece, a critical piece, I think, for the architecture of data management, mapping, and decisions is transparency. Because if you work with modelers now, people are working with these unique structures that don't necessarily translate well to other endeavors. And so you've got to make what you did be validatable retrospectively. So you can show the data layers that went in, you can show your assumptions, you can show the grain or resolution that you were using, and those pieces are often sort of elided by, I think.
Great. Well, that's not seeing other hands. I warned both of you, I'm going to ask you this question. So, how does your work, and what would your thoughts be that builds on what Brand challenged all of us to think about, which would be a Bill of Rights for the planet? It seems to me both of you are offering some ideas related to that. So
you go first.
Yeah, okay. So
that's right.
Go ahead.
You guys go first, right?
Yeah. You mentioned do no harm.
Okay, no, I'll take a stab at it. Basically, he gave me this question before the talk started, so I had a little time, like all of 3 minutes to think about it. But I think that all profound human activities begin with an end in mind. If you look at Chartres, if you look at the Mona Lisa, if you look at the Manhattan Project, as inglorious as that might have been, if you look at Sputnik, guys didn't sit on a sofa and go, well, let's put some stuff in space, I don't know. You begin with this articulated end state that is of profound significance to the human condition. Chartres is a wonderful example. Great and well thought through sciences as well. So unless you have those norming values and unless you have your endpoint a priori, you're just going to be screwing around and you're going to be a techie. And we will lose, as we are losing now, everything that we most value. So you've got to say where you're going. You have to be bold enough to put yourself out there. And you've got to say, Yellowstone, all the pieces, all the processes. 500 years is too short. I'm going for perpetuity. Make the bold statement and reverse engineer it. Because without that, we're going to slide down the slippery slope. Last thing I'll say, I'm sorry, hogging airtime, but
that's okay.
If you co-map time since the beginning of human occupancy in agriculture and desertification, loss of trophic levels, they map beautifully. Start in the Middle East, where agriculture began, and look at the degree of desertification and species loss. Have any of you guys ever been there? It's not a non-proven process. I was just in the UK last year, the apex carnivore there used to be bears and wolves. It's a red fox, 5 pounds. That's the top carnivore now because of the intensity of human occupancy. This isn't sort of a hypothetical. This is what we do and how we do it, unless we choose to do what has been done in Europe very successfully, like the King's set-asides, where the last bits of old-growth forest remain, or the border of Poland, where there are still free-roaming bison. Those set-asides were decisively placed and protected, and we can do that. We just have to want to.
So would another principle be end extinctions, end species extinction?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
So like,
Including humans.
amphibians, pollinators, apex
Right.
carnivores.
Right.
This isn't like a speculation. This is a done deal. We've done it already.
Yeah. Al?
I don't know, geodesign is the foundation of all of our land use planning. I think that should be. No, I think we should throw the book away in what we have been doing in the past in planning and zoning. I think it's proven not to work. And we're hanging on to these outdated notions. We were talking about zoning, this morning, and the fact that that whole construct doesn't work anymore. We've got to start over again and take a new approach to how we're going to envision the future with respect to making land use decisions. And, I think that's what this whole conversation is all about. And I'm proud to say that Florida has taken a big first step in that process by essentially getting rid of its planning agency that used a purely regulatory mindset and is now thinking about incentives. And incentives, when done properly, are very powerful things. And so I think we have to move away from this regulatory construct of land use, and we need to be more enabling and more thoughtful. I mean, I guess that conversation this morning about how decisions are being made in the absence of any knowledge, it's frightening, but it happens day in and day out. And so just taking the time to make more thoughtful decisions would be a big step.
So an incentive system that encourages people to do the right thing rather than the wrong
Absolutely.
thing.
Yeah. Right. And by its nature, once it's too easy to say it's an incentive, but then there's a backstop, which is the regulation that says, but by the way, you got to do it anyway. Well, that's not truly an incentive. So it has to be something that is going to resonate with people in order for them to make that choice.
Sure.
And then they have to have the choice.
Right. Other questions from the audience? Okay, here, yes.
I'm Ken Wall from a couple hundred miles north of Yellowstone. We're working on a north central Montana project that is one of the HUD projects it goes beyond conservation. The main incentives we have there are to get walkability, et cetera, to these rural communities are federal grants, if they build those into their growth plan. So how would you transition from the conservation stewardship to more, community stewardship or happiness index or, something beyond stewardship for conservation?
Wow. It's having an ability to measure something like well-being, is maybe a starting point. If we can agree on what constitutes that set of, results that would have well-being. Gallup's got a well-being index I know that's used, that measures, relative health and a lot of other criteria. But for physical planning, it really does come down to some pretty simple things. If you look at communities that people want to live in when they have the choice, and what are the common attributes of those kinds of communities, it's not that hard to figure it out. It's certainly something that's in balance with the natural environment. It's walkability, it's diversity, it's economic richness. It's a lot of things that are trying to be built into this smart growth concept. The thing is that in order to get that to happen, again, we have to break a lot of rules that have been built up over years and years and years. So, I like that. I think we need to progress this whole idea of smart growth and sustainability to the next level as well, and really get people to be thinking not just about what's happening around them in their community, but what's happening in the larger context, and that awareness and connectivity of the fact that, hey, when I make a choice to live in this community, that choice has had a variety of impacts, including displacing whatever was there before, which might have been a natural habitat, so then you have to have that connectivity.
Yeah.
You know, Jen, one of the things that your work really impresses me about is this notion, by developing metrics for ecosystem health the way we do for human health, it suggests that there's the opportunity to show how ecosystem health has an impact on human health.
Yeah, well done.
And so, because that's the data, so those are data that we don't have.
Yeah.
You know, what happens in terms of human health when, you know, certain species become extinct?
Yeah, or we cut down all the trees.
Or
And we
cut down
do
all the trees,
understand that with pollinators, that's really clear agriculturally. And I think we understand it intuitively, but to make those stories be more accessible and broadly disseminated is really important. And it runs counter to the sort of flash, I want to be super entertained every moment of my life thread that we're going to have to sort of take a step back from. I think that's a problem. And Shannon, when he said I could come here, he said I could say provocative things. So I'm just going to say one other thing, though, but the thread that runs through all of this, I think, is that unless we can step back from the consumer culture where we believe and tell our children, you will be more happy if you have the, that's so intimately linked to the wrenching decisions that we're making, you know. That's a really huge issue that we need to think about. The dominant narrative architecture of our lives right now is pretty pernicious, and it's pretty hard for little people to slow down and to enjoy the things that perhaps we might most value that relate to Tom's excellent point about what will make us more healthy.
Right. So another principle is slow down.
Yeah,
Pay
totally.
attention.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, great. Well, you both have been terrific. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's inspiring words.